On the 4th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me. The Calling Birds, or Blind Youth, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Once upon a time, in a land far away and forgotten by all who still draw breath, there was a town without neighbour or friend, and whose residents had long forgotten how they came to be there. But they were happy to be there, for they had their own customs and ways, their own times and celebrations, and their own trials and dangers, which kept them locked in the borders of their little town. Mostly. Now, at the end of the drive, before the face of Cunningham Manor, there stood a group of Cunninghams and staff around a boy of 12, nearly 13, who was none too pleased of his carriage to be trotting away. His name was Michael Allen, and he stood with a slouch, his short-sleeved linen shirt tucked into his blue short trousers like his hands in his pockets. He flicked from Cyrus Cunningham to his new wife, Michael's cousin, and to his niece and nephew, he supposed. "It's rather odd being younger than your niece and nephew," he thought, tucking his shaggy auburn hair behind an ear. "Little Michael," his cousin said, with a sweet smile that made him scoff under his breath. "We're delighted to have you." She unlaced her arm from Cyrus's and came forward, hands on her swollen stomach beneath the scarlet gown. She embraced him, tucking him to the side until his face nearly smashed into her breast. He sighed and hugged her with one arm, rolling his eyes as she stooped and whispered in his ear, "Do not misbehave whilst here, you understand?" It came sweet and light, in case the others overheard, but she'd taken that tone enough for him to know the truth of it. "You needn't enjoy this, but don't make these people miserable. They're family now. I'm sure it'll be a grand adventure," he said, looking up to his cousin with a perfect smile and dead eyes. She grinned, but her gaze was venomous before she turned them back to face her new family. "All too eager to forget your old one," he thought. "But I can't say I blame you." Esther Cunningham smiled from her father's side. She was a monolith for Cunningham looks. Slender, fair face, inky hair, and piercing blue eyes. Then there was her height, tall for a woman grown, let alone a girl of 18, even taller than his cousin. "She probably spends half the fortune tailoring her gowns," he thought. "There's no mistaking you two for cousins," Esther said. "One can know you have Allen blood for certain," Ezra said on his father's right, looking like a younger reflection of Cyrus in his house suit and slicked back hair. His cousin laughed and returned to her husband's arm, eyes barely coming to the bottom of his shoulder. "Really? I've never seen a resemblance between us, have you, little cousin?" He resisted the urge to sneer, and only pocketed his hands with a grin. "Oh, never. Not with you, cousin." It was a lie, but one no one seemed to care about, and truthfully, they were more like to be siblings than not. All the living Allens were, thanks to the patriarchs, 3 being triplets. They had the Allens' brown eyes and auburn hair, the wide, square face, and the ruddy, freckled skin. "The old folk knows what that pupp'll look like when they slough off the cowl," he thought, looking up from his cousin's swollen stomach. The spark in his cousin's eyes jumped for a moment, as the corners of her mouth downturned so slightly he could barely see it. She squeezed Cyrus's arm until he looked down to her. "Are you all right, dear?" She laughed and nodded her head, motioning to Michael's luggage aside. "Of course. Now, why don't we go in and get changed? I'm sure Michael would love to see the grounds and the house." "I'm fine as I am, if I could wander alone." He looked up to Cyrus, towering giant that he was, with raised eyebrows. Cyrus gave a devilish grin and motioned to his son. "I'm afraid not. Ezra will accompany you around the house and stay near if you wish to wander the grounds." They all turned and meandered up to the steps, the staff bustling to grab the luggage and opened the door in their black suits and white gowns. "If you wish to go about the river or the bridge, or go riding, or whatsoever you should desire, Ezra's volunteered to be your man." Of course, you're free to wander the manor without a guard, aren't you? Ezra said beside him, elbow nudging his shoulder. Michael looked up. The boy was shorter than Cyrus, but still too tall, and Ezra winked with a smile like his father's. Good to know, old man. My thanks. He nudged Ezra's side with his shoulder, just hard enough to make his step falter, and kept on as the Cunningham boy corrected himself at the base of the steps. Michael stopped, flicking between the two cat statues either side the doors, black as the Cunningham hair, watching them with one set of jade eyes and the other some yellow stone. They're precious, aren't they? Esther said, without turning, and went through after her father and cousin Barbara. Yes, Miss Cunningham. I've never seen statues so finely made. He looked back past Ezra as they passed the doors and up again as the Cunningham boy spoke. Their names are Tooth and Claw. They've guarded our home for several years now. He smiled almost sadly as Michael turned to face the foyer, while the party dispersed through the house to their chambers, so to change clothes for the evening. I'll show you to your lodging, Ezra said, padding silently over the stone floor and ornate rug draping the huge staircase. Come. He waved Michael on, the poise gone and a boy's grin in its place. Michael huffed a smile and sprinted forward with furrowed brows, scanning the rug and the strange scene of antlered naked men running with bows after stags, repeating up the whole length. When they reached the top, Ezra kept a slow pace for Michael and explained the way they would go to the chambers so that he wouldn't get lost if ever he went alone. He explained the paintings as they went too, most of the Cunninghams from centuries past, but many more of strange beasts and scenes of the town's history and fables. One was of a monstrous thing shackled in chains, its body huge and muscled under white fur, its head like a great cat not seen in generations, and its tail barbed. Yellow venom dripped from its snarling maw as a man in old robes and trousers thrust out his hand before the creature's face, his long black hair blasted back from the monster's roar. Ezra said it was an old Cunningham bed story, their patriarch subduing a monster beset to them by the old folk before they were driven from the valley. But I've always thought it more a metaphor, our ancestors braving danger and bending the wilds to their will for the betterment of who would become the townsfolk. Then, as they took the eastern wing to the bedchambers, they came onto a terrace overlooking 4 stories straight to the ground floor. The walls were lined with stone people of all types, and all clothed in real garments, armored in queer suits and modern plate, dressed in gowns, riding attire, rags, pelts, and finery alike. Windows between let in the light enough to see their faces, and what faces indeed! So expertly carved were they, Michael stopped and stared, mouth slack. "They're so real," he said, as Ezra came around and leaned on the railing with his elbows, nearly bending in half. "Indeed. Some have stood for so long my grandfather mightn't even have known who had them made. But a few he put there himself. A few my father, and also my Uncle Felix." Then he stood and knelt with his back to Michael. "Well, if we're to explore the grounds before supper, we should hurry. On my back, young Allen!" Michael chuckled and furrowed his brows, asking if Ezra was serious, and laughing when he climbed onto his back and creased his evening jacket. Then they were off, up another flight of stairs and around some corners, before they found the bedchambers. Ezra set Michael down, panting, and showed him to his door, turning the brassy knob and pushing it open. It was square and spacious, with twin windows across from the side of his bed against the northern wall. His luggage had already been brought up and sat empty beside the drawers opposite the foot of his bed, clothes put away. Michael turned, ignoring the man's face carved into the wood of the door, emerging from vines and brush. "My room's next to yours if you need me. I'll just be a moment to change, then we can go explore the grounds if you'd like still." "Thank you." He smiled, the sarcasm bleeding away as he unpocketed his hands, and nodded. "I'll just be a moment." Something screamed down the hall and Michael jumped, facing the wall his bed was against, blood cold and eyes wide. "What from hell?" Ezra barked a quick laugh, then cleared his throat with a smile like they'd shared an inside joke. "Your cousin keeps birds. She has a room of them at the end of the hall, and I'm afraid the newest ones haven't gotten used to their cages yet."
"What are they, devil fowl?"
Michael asked. Venom returned as he scowled and shook his head. Ezra only chuckled, crossing his arms as he leaned on the doorway. "They're just newly caged. Hopefully they'll learn to calm themselves before tonight." He pushed off the door and headed for his chambers, still talking before he shut his own door. "I'd hate for your first night to be full of that." As if commanded, the birds sent up another chorus of chaotic cries. Even the clanking of their cages came down the hall. Michael growled and shut his door, grumbling about his cousin as he slid off his blue trousers for a simple pair of linen shorts that he gathered at the waist with a leather belt. Soon after, Ezra knocked on his door and brought him outside, having changed into simple linens and trousers. But the sun didn't last long, so he brought them back in for supper and promised they could explore more in the morning. But, lying in his bed, Michael stared at the ceiling and cursed his cousin as the raucous birds screamed and pecked and jumped, the sound coming through the walls like there were none. Even when he imagined the noises were his cousin's screams as she was flogged or murdered, he couldn't smile or laugh. He just lay there and grumbled until he was too tired to be angry and fell into the cold hands of sleep. But sleep was fleeting. Thrice Michael woke in the night to those screams, and again in the wee hours. He snarled and threw off his blankets, rushing to his door with a snare and casting it open to pad down the rest of the hall on his tiptoes until he came to the final door. It was ornate and covered in little songbirds lighting on branches and swooping from imagined heights. He half wondered if Cyrus had made the door for his cousin as a wedding gift, it and the ornate frame, or if it was just something left over from his older years. But he couldn't dwell on it, hand thrusting onto the knob and pushing the door open as the hellish screeching beat against his ears. He charged into the room, head spinning, scanning the spacious cages for the devils that kept him from slumber. They lined the walls, great wire things running floor to ceiling with 3 levels and several paddocks each. Then there were those atop the rows of tables in the middle of the room, and the ones hanging from the ceiling instead of a blasted light. He crept between the cages, all the birds cawing and growling at him, until his ears pricked at the familiar throaty scream. He raced across the room, past owls, vultures, robins, eagles, and hawks, to a cage big as himself set atop one of the long tables in the back corner of the room, looking out the nearby window. He scowled inside as the creatures howled, high, low, throaty, breathy, all of it, sung as one, like they were all possessed. "Not too far off," he grumbled, and stepped out of the light to better look and sneer at the 4 ravens flapping and screaming. They were almost words. "Bob's trying to teach you how to speak, no doubt." He touched the cage and the creatures shied back, hopping on the floor of their prison and jamming open their beaks to growl at him with raised feathers. He smirked and jostled the cage. The creatures stumbled and righted themselves, squawking curses at him. He did it again and again with a snaking smile that twisted his face. The ravens fell back and forth, half screaming and half choking on their screams. Then Michael laughed, keeping it lower than the creatures' cries, but it didn't stop until he stood back, panting, and admired the jostled, drunk-looking beasts. He sneered at them and ripped the cage open, grabbed one by the breast with his little hands and thrashed it while they were still dizzy. It screamed, wrestling, mouth snapping open and shut, feet clawing at the air as it fought him with its large wings. Spread out, they were nearly wide as Michael's shoulders. He tossed it down and shut the door, the creature croaking and panting on the floor as the other 3 huddled round it, nudging it with their beaks and cooing low to one another, until the thrashed one lifted its head and shook to its feet. Michael grinned and wiped his nose, panting as he ignored their black and brown glares, and sauntered out of the room back to his chambers as the sun crested. He sat on his bed amid the silence and sighed, smiling as he lay back on the blankets and shut his eyes. Utter bliss. He grinned, basking in it as the sun lit the chambers through the twin windows. yet I cannot enjoy it for sleep. Still, Ezra's to take me out after breakfast, so it's not all lost." Then with a yawn he rushed out of his nightdress and into a linen short-sleeved shirt and shorts, lacing his boots and running down the stairs to gobble up breakfast under the watchful glare of his elder cousin as they discussed the boring blood feud between houses Allen and Taylor. After Ezra changed into a linen long-sleeve and riding trousers and boots, he brought Michael to the stables and readied 2 horses. One his current saddle, and the other his from boyhood. Michael still had trouble fitting into the seat and slipping his feet in place at the same time, but he would manage. Then they were off a horse, wandering the grounds to trot along the length of Python River and over and back Python Bridge. They circled Cunning Hill and visited the animals where Michael tried to catch a chicken, one of the red foreign things Ezra told him his Uncle Felix had bartered for. Then they went to the edge of the eastern woods, where Ezra refused to take him further, even after Michael begged to see Swan Lake. "There's nothing there so fine for you to see. It's a lake, young Allen, and not one meant for us to swim in." His face, once boyish, with sweat on his brow and a troublesome grin to his red lips, turned into the eastern woods and changed. It was grave, serious, his jaw tense, his eyes deep in thought or fear. Then he looked up and smacked his lips. "Come, it must be time for luncheon, and I could do with a bite." He turned his horse round, even as Michael protested. "Michael, come. The grounds will be here when we've done, and think of the energy we'll have to explore the rest of the day." He smiled over his shoulder, and Michael sighed, grumbling agreement as they trotted back to the manor's face and readied themselves for the midday meal. But Michael had an idea. He excused himself before they would eat in the dining hall, requesting to change into something less sweaty. But when he reached his door, he went past it to the ornate one at the end. He peeked inside to check for his cousin and found it empty, wondering when she tended to her birds or if she did at all. "She probably has the servants do it all," he thought, making his way beside the wall of cages and silent birds. He rounded the corner, not noticing how the creatures bristled as he passed, and laced between the tables, examining the collie birds, reds, blues, yellows, and black. None of them sang their sweet tunes. None even fluttered their wings, they just stared, standing stock still on the floor of their cages, or their roosts or nests as he passed. Then the 4 beasts screamed. One peeked its beak through the bars and caught sight of him, screeching as he approached, taunting Michael as it rose in stunted flight and beat its body against the bars. He jumped in front of it, smile carving his face as his eyes snared, hands up like claws. The blackbird fell back with a cry, knocking into one of its fellows and sending all 4 into a cacophony. They leapt and took wing, flying up into the bars and falling back down as they squawked at one another before they quieted down and slowly fixed their brown eyes on him. He stood straight with a laugh, careful not to be too loud, and leaned on the table with his hands either side the cage. He smirked and tilted his head, wiggling his finger between the bars as the 4 ravens stood motionless, feathers bristling on their napes. He only smiled at them and gripped the corner bars. He braced himself and lifted the cage off the table with all his might, shaking it and sending the ravens sprawling over their prison floor, wings flapping, knocking onto their backs and sides, beaks nearly cutting the others. But he set the cage down with a little pant around his chuckle, hands finding his hips as he looked at the open door over his shoulder and returned. He leant down, bending at the hip to whisper something at his victims. "Maybe shut up, and I won't come back." But before he could finish the last word, one of the ravens found its feet and threw itself at the bars with a growling call, almost like words. Wings flared, eyes burning as his beak plunged between the bars. Michael came upright in a blink and stumbled back, knocking into the cages on the wall and sending the owls into a fit as he stared at the snarling raven, his smug mask fallen away. Then he took a breath and marched forward, fist swinging through the air and landing into the cage wall, almost sending it over the table ledge if not for his quick catch. The raven screamed and flailed, beaks breaking through the bars after him as he slammed the cage back down, ignoring the bent bars where the bird had worked its head through. Then he huffed, face red and twisted as the rest of him, going hot as he squeezed his fists so tight at his sides that nails cut his skin. But he didn't slam the door, nor fling his open, nor forgot what he'd said he meant to do, and hurriedly dressed into nicer dining clothes that he could still wear outside to explore with Ezra. And indeed, it was a day of exploring, just as Ezra had promised. They took the horses along the whole perimeter of the house, and even ventured a little into the northern wood, with both promising to be quiet about it if the other did. They didn't go far, fearing the ire of Lord Cyrus Cunningham, but they couldn't have gone far a horse anyway with the north's untamed, unkempt wild woods. The trees were ancient, some older than the first settlers, and twisted. Oaks older than Cunning Hill, pines and evergreens that littered the floor with needle and leaf, as they had for doubtless millennia. It was no place to bring a horse. But they did go further east, even hunting a rabbit for a short while and strapping it to the back of Michael's horse. Though Ezra had been the one to take the shot. And even though Ezra still refused to take Michael to Swan Lake, he brought him to a monstrously tall tree and tied off the horses, telling him to climb. He showed Michael where to grip and swing and what branch was safe to stand on and not, until they both stood atop one of the high branches and looked out over the whole country. The valley was wide, a sprawling green sea of forests all round the red, white, and brown heart of the town and its pale pastures. And around all of that were the purple and black mountains, miles off, glittering in the warm evening sun, their peaks white, no matter how low, with some of them reaching up far past the fiery clouds. But then Ezra, hanging to the side from a branch, nudged Michael's shoulders and pointed down to a lake not far below them. "Swan Lake," he'd said, his long hair loose and flapping over his shoulders in the wind. "I can't take you there, but you can see it safely from my old tree." He'd looked down at Michael with a fond smile and ruffled his wind-tossed hair, too short to tie away but too long to keep from his face. Michael had smiled and nodded, thanking him as he found it and studied it. The sweeping tides, the cool, clean water flowing from the Python, the sandy banks and massive ancient trees with their roots twisted and weaving into the water. A light fog hung over the lake where the sunlight couldn't reach, and the glistening swans swam inside, flapping their wings and calling out, dancing, with their heads high like earthly angels. "So, there are actual swans in the lake after all?" Michael had laughed. Ezra answered his laugh with another, but his face wasn't light. It was shaped the way adults always did when they remembered something sad or scary but didn't want to say so. "Thank you for this," Michael said as they made their way down. "For what? Climbing a tree?" Ezra laughed and landed on the ground, reaching up and helping Michael the rest of the way down. "For showing me the grounds, and at least acting like you're enjoying yourself." He climbed his horse, and Ezra released the reins, mounting his own with a furrowed brow. "I know boys of our ages don't mix, least of all my cousins, but you've been better than kind. You're fun." Ezra smiled, a genuine, deep thing that wrinkled his eyes and bunched up his nose and showed all of his teeth. He chuckled and led them back toward the manor as he answered. "Michael, if I might say, I've never had a brother, though perhaps soon. Nevertheless, I endeavor to treat you like one of our own, given we're now kin. So, be us cousins, brothers, or all the rest, I'm gladdened to hear you feel so welcome in our family and home." Michael blinked, his face slack, before he cleared his throat and put on a small smile, thanking him as his guts stirred and his head felt a little lighter than before, his shoulders at least a good deal lighter than when he was at home. But then they were returned, and the horses are stabled by the groundskeeper, Mr. Arnold. Supper was served, and Cyrus asked after the boys' adventures, all of them letting Michael blabber about it until the meal was done, and after, as they enjoyed chilled sweet cream with fruit by a low fire. The hearth, an intricate design of wrestling bears either side the mouth, and the mantle covered in stags chased by naked antlered men, went unnoticed by Michael as he and Ezra sat beside each other and recounted their tales, laughing at one another as the rest joined in. Even his cousin Barbara showed her true smile and laughed the way he remembered when she was young and unbothered by the affairs of their family. But the revelry ended as they all yawned and retired upstairs, the lord and his lady going down one hall and all the rest the other. And as Michael lay in his bed, smiling and thinking how it had been such a good day, wondering what the next might have in store for him, there came the squawking screams. His face soured and twisted as the memories of his adventures were pushed aside to his secret play in the bird room. The fear and anger in the ravens' eyes, the way their bodies flopped about, how they fluttered and flapped while he thrashed their cage. He smiled, his eyes shut as the screaming came in and out, and imagined what he might do to them. How he might reach inside and take one by the throat, how he might break their legs so they couldn't right themselves when he thrashed the cage, how he might snap their wings. And imagination turned to dream as he slept. The next day was much like the last, though Ezra couldn't think of anywhere else to explore, so they played games instead. Archery, racing round the house, racing the horses, from the drive to Python Bridge and back, even trying to chase a chicken that would become part of supper that night. But first, Michael visited the ravens before he'd even tasted the smell of breakfast, and then again, after he'd eaten luncheon, and then again before supper, always excusing himself with something mundane that everyone would believe. And again, the ravens screamed through the night, and Michael dreamed of what he might do to them, though he could never truly do to them what he wished, or else his cousin and her servants would see and he'd be found out. The next day, though, was different. The door was already open in the morning, and his cousin's singing trailed down the hall instead of the dreadful caws, so he had to wait until after breakfast to play his secret games. Thereafter, though, there was little fun to be had with Ezra, as he wished to spend time with his sister and help her pack her luggage.
"Where's she leaving to?"
Michael had asked when Ezra broke him the news. "She'll be staying a few days with the Fishers, so Jasper can
caught her into his arms."
He'd put on a higher, lighter voice and clutched his hands together as if he were a swooning maiden, but then sighed and ruffled Michael's mess of hair. "Sorry, friend. But once she's away, we can find something to do, surely." But time ticked on, and Michael was left to explore the manor alone, though the staff and servants often appeared and vanished from round corners as if made of air, watching him, he knew. He wandered each floor wherever he might, going widdershins from the east and up and widdershins again until he'd stalked most of the manor. He found a grand library with 2 stories high, and full of things that he couldn't understand, and there was the observatory on the northwestern corner above the servants' quarters, star charts and calendars lining the walls between great cases of old thick books, and the fabled courtyard where Helena Cunningham used to keep her garden of beasts, still green and fenced away, but now empty of her old pets. He found the armory, full of old weapons and suits and things that he didn't know of. He found the grand dining hall and its cloth-covered tables. He even found a stairwell that took him into a long, dark tunnel that ended in 2 massive stone doors that he couldn't push open no matter what he did. Their faces had a naked, strong man on the right with cloven hooves for feet and antlers, while the left had a woman after the same fashion, and wild trees behind them both. Queerest of all, though, he found in the north wing. A whole division of the wing, floor to roof, was wide open, one room over the other and directly connected by stairs like the servants' quarters, but full of brown marble columns. The floor was dark jade, the walls were painted with lively scenes of the northern wood, the ceiling was painted to look like the night sky through tall branches, and when he looked at the floor he realized it wasn't all jade. There was a river of varnished wood snaking between the columns, beginning at the southerly double doors to those great rooms, and ending at a massive dais opposite them in the north. He stepped onto the highest dais, the doors made of wooden squares with multicolored windows like a rainbow, and down to the ground. There was a path at the rear of the manor where several trails around bled together and flowed north under the boughs of the ancient trees.
Ezra never showed me that,
he'd said to himself. But eventually, after luncheon, a carriage had arrived for Esther, bringing Jasper Fisher with a man in front to drive the horses and another to take her luggage. They all stood in the front to see her out and greet the young Fisher, a man of 20 now, and already aiding in his father's affairs. It was a long, talkative departure that saw them standing and laughing for close to an hour, Esther and his cousin Barbara standing close and whispering things to one another that made them chuckle quietly and turned Esther red in the throat. But the men didn't notice. Cyrus, Ezra, and Jasper were too busy talking about the affairs of the town, the wealth the Fishers had come into after flooding the eastern fields and rearing his golden geese, though there was something interesting said low about managing the curse within the eggs, yet Michael couldn't hear it all before Jasper broke into some jokes as explanation. Eventually, Esther and Jasper left with smiles on their faces and laughter in their throats, carrying through the air as the carriage pulled away. Something flew out the window once they were far down the trail, then something else from the other side, followed by a screech of laughter. Cyrus chuckled, pointing so that Barbara would look. "He's a strange boy, I hear."
"But he knows how to behave himself,"
Barbara said, lacing her arms into Cyrus's.
"Besides, your Esther seems quite happy because of his strangeness."
Cyrus smiled and looked down at her, tracing her cheek with his thumb. "Yes, indeed. Let's just hope that his jokes don't take him too far."
"My dear Lord Cunningham,"
Barbara teased, and raised onto her tiptoes to kiss his nose.
"Whenever has oddity been ill for this family?"
He chuckled and straightened, following the carriage as it disappeared down the path. "I just hope he remembers the proper times to play fool and lord. That's a hard thing sometimes. Usually one has to die, and Esther does love him so for his foolery." "He's a good man, Father," Ezra said, making Michael jump. "He's young, but he's been learning his father's trade since he was my age. I think he might well be able to play jester and king alike." Cyrus faced his son with a pleased smile and clapped his back, hanging his arm over Ezra's shoulder as he leaned down and whispered something into his ear. Ezra nodded and chuckled, thanking his father before they all returned to the house, and Ezra made good on his promise. Then, after luncheon, Michael quenched his imaginations and played his secret games with the birds, and again before bed, and yet again in the night when they squawked worse than ever before. But the last saw more than games. The sound was worse, far worse, and their eyes were cold and knowing, as cold as his other cousins, and his uncles, and his father's. This time, when he stalked up to their cage with bold fists and red face, he reached inside and grabbed one by the breast. It tried to peck at him, but he jostled it and ran to the window, opening it and flinging the creature into the air. It spun and fell before it opened its wings and flapped half drunk. Then he came back and did it a second and a third time, and took hold of the final raven, one wing still free and flapping like mad as it cursed half-words at him. He reached the window, ready to throw it out, and clapped his hand over his mouth as its beak ripped into his thumb. He flung it hard, cheek bleeding between his teeth as he fought to keep the scream down and sucked the blood from the wound. The raven spread wing and flapped away, following a breeze back around.
Michael,
came the raven before it flew off with the rest. He looked at his hand and the trickle of blood under the moon. Then he sighed and got to work, covering up his play. He shut the door to muffle the noises and bent the bars of the cage open enough to allow a bird to squeeze through. Then he shut the window and broke one of the square panes with his slipper over his fist. Lastly, and most importantly, He set the cage down on its side and jostled it to make it look like it had fallen over onto the floor. With the room staged to look as if the ravens had escaped, he crept back to his bed and wrapped his hand in an old rag, sighing at the ringing silence. He shut his eyes and fell into the black of dreamless sleep. The next day, no one had noticed the silence or Michael's staging. Everyone ate breakfast. Everyone went about their business, and Ezra brought him to the stables to help him saddle a horse. But as the minutes passed, Michael did less and less, replaced by one of the staff, until he wandered outside the stables and picked up a stick to play swords. He assumed something like the stance his older cousins took when they trained, raising the stick and positioning his feet badly before he swung again. Then he knelt with the stick high like his opponent had struck. He sneered and kicked out, spinning and falling to his shoulder before he rolled back to his feet and pointed the stick at his imagined enemy. Then he lunged, and again, and imagined the enemy jumping to the side, so he slashed after it, running it down until he imagined it losing its footing and falling back. He leapt, stick raised, and drove it into the earth, right into the enemy's throat between helm and mail. He stood, panting, and tossed the stick away to turn down the path to the thin patch of trees around the stables. He headed for the shade, hand up against the light with his back to the discarded toy, when something caught. He jumped and spun, finding a crow on the toy sword. No, a raven. He chuckled at himself, then set his hands on his hips and whispered, "I just got rid of 4 of you. I trust they weren't your friends?" The raven chirped and called, almost words. "What was that? A no, no doubt."
My call,
came the bird. He stood straight, eyes wide and chills crawling up his spine as his face went slack and rigid.
Michael,
the bird said again.
Michael, thank you.
Another voice croaked behind him. He spun and looked into the branches, stopping on another raven in the lowest branch. It quirked its head, beak coming open in short call before it repeated,
Thank you.
How?
Let us. Thank you.
He spun and found another raven at his right. He backed away, jumping, mouth twisting to something like fright, but hotter, wringing tears from his eyes.
Properly.
He whirled to find the voice above him, and the 4th raven falling, wings outstretched, claws open. He gasped, then the creature's claws dug into his cheeks, and its beak sunk into his forehead. He screamed, the wings covering his face as another set of claws sunk into his ear. He swung wildly, spinning and screaming, but something bit his hand over and over. Then the pain at his ear was gone and a raven croaked before it dug into the back of his knee. He gasped, eyes thrown open as he stumbled and fell back. Then the bird at his face reared up.
Thank you,
it croaked. Then its beak sunk to the hilt in Michael's left eye. He shrieked, the ground slamming into his back and driving the air from his lungs as the raven reared up, blood spraying off its beak as it flapped its wings and roared a great caw that came again and again like a laugh.
Master Allen?
A gruff man's voice came from somewhere down the path.
Help me!
He screamed and flailed, good eye going wide as another beak fell on his fingers, tearing them open and stabbing through his palm. He writhed, turning over and casting off the raven, scrambling to his hands and knees to plead with the man, Mr. Arnold. But he didn't get the chance to rush forward. Another set of claws found the back of his leg before the beak dug into his heel. He screamed and kicked, squinting his eye as the birds hopped over him, circling, cawing and taunting him.
Michael!
The croak came again, and he opened his good eye, freezing on the burning brown gaze of the raven before his face. He sputtered a breath, tears and blood mixing on his cheeks as he tried to find a word to say. Then it drove its head forward and the beak ran through his other eye. Michael screamed, hand slapping to his face and shoving the bird away as Arnold's footsteps came closer. "Away!" he shouted as his feet pounded gravel and dust. "Shoo! Off him! Away, I said!" The ravens flapped and clawed, singing their laughter as they rose above them, circling. Arnold pulled Michael up and flipped him, hands going over him, checking his wounds before they found his face, and the man barely stopped himself from gasping. Michael sobbed, trembling in the man's arms as he squeezed his eyes shut and open and shut again, hissing at the burn and fire. But there was only darkness. Darkness and the sting of their beaks and claws in his heel, his hands, his face, his cheeks, his eyes. "Master Ezra!" Arnold shouted, lifting Michael off the ground and moving them forward. He hung in the man's arms like dead weight as they came to a stop, Arnold's voice booming again and cutting short. "Arnold?" Then Ezra's voice went taut. "Michael, what happened?" He must have rushed forward because the next moment his hands were on Michael, checking his wounds, hissing, cursing. "Michael, what happened?"
What was going on, boy?
Arnold asked, barely a breath.
I was playing swords. The birds.
His throat gave out, breath turning into a sob as the cold adrenaline waned and the sting in his face began to burn.
"It hurts."
He trembled.
"Ezra, what were you doing?"
Arnold's voice came harsh. "I was saddling a horse." Ezra sounded distant. Michael reached for him, not wanting him to leave, and his hand found his chest. Ezra took his hand as he continued speaking, but the words were like whispers as the burn climbed in his flesh and he squirmed in Arnold's arms.
"To your father. He'll be able to do something, surely,"
Arnold said. Ezra sighed. "My father's strong, but we'll see." He leaned down, hand holding Michael still by the forehead as the heat of his face settled over Michael's. Ezra breathed through his nostrils and came away. "It smells of something else."
"They spoke,"
Michael whimpered.
"The ravens, words. I heard."
Ezra shushed him before a cold silence fell between Ezra and Arnold. "To my father, now."
"You're faster, boy. Can you carry him?"
The horse whinnied and its hooves trotted over the compact earth. Ezra heaved, then the stink of horse came near. "Give him to me. I'll ride into his study if need be. And the horn." Arnold passed Michael up into a saddle before Ezra wrapped his arm around Michael's chest and he held him a saddle with his thighs. Then the horse lurched forward into a full gallop uphill. "I've got you, Michael," Ezra called over the scream of the horse.
"Michael,"
one of the ravens said. Michael trembled, bloody tears falling down as he covered his ears.
"Thank you, Michael, for the meal."
"Be silent!" Ezra screamed. Then he whispered something that Michael didn't understand, something that sent chills over his skin all the same. The ravens cursed with strange words and cawed, their voices more and more distant by the second as Ezra blew the horn and filled the air with a deep rumble. He blew it 6 times as they went, panting behind Michael and whispering the same strange words between each blast. "Father!" "Who is it?" "Dear God!" Cyrus's voice came in front of the horse as they stopped. "Bring him inside, quickly. I have to run the grounds with Arnold. Something's not right." Ezra set Michael into someone else's arms, then Cyrus spoke above him. "What do you mean?" "The ravens that attacked him. Michael says they spoke. I heard them. Something's come into the grounds." "I should ward the border. Mend him," Ezra said sharply. "I know what to do, Father. Just put him back together as best you can. You heal better than me, and Esther isn't here." Cyrus sighed, then must have nodded as Ezra's horse whinnied and turned in a flurry of dirt and gravel, the horn filling the air and getting further away by the second, back the way that they'd come. Then Ezra's voice came in a shout to Arnold, but he couldn't understand it.
"What's happening?"
Michael asked, turning into Cyrus's chest and wincing when his eyes touched the soft fabric of the Lord's blouse. "Don't worry, my boy." Cyrus petted Michael's head, shushing him as they turned, and Cyrus sprinted up steps. "I'll see to you myself. You! Prepare the chamber.
Yes, that one. Now. You. Make the call. I don't care if it isn't the right time. Get on the roof and blow that bloody horn. Get the king here now.
Lord Cyrus, I'm scared.
Michael cried into his shirt, and Cyrus hugged him tighter as they flew down a hall and made a sharp turn, the man crying out as he slammed into the wall and kept running. I know, Michael. Don't worry. I'll do everything in my power to help you. And where I fail, I'm sure the king will be able to reverse the magic done you.
What king?
Michael sobbed as the smell of cold earth hung in the air. Well, Michael, it's a little early, but you would have met him soon anyway. Cyrus chuckled as they stopped, and 2 doors thudded open like stone on stone, echoing in an enormous chamber beyond. And it'll cost us, you and I. But tonight, you'll meet the king of the woods folk.
4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves.